Hi, everybody. Today we're going to start talking about osteology. Um, osteo always means bone. Ology always means the study of. So what we're talking about is the study of bones and bone growth. We're going to talk a lot about how bones actually change and grow throughout our lives. We've talked a little bit about this already. We entertain the ideas with talking about occupational bone remodeling. In this section, we're going to find out how that works, how that happens, what causes the bone to change and modify throughout life, and in fact, how those changes really kind of influence our bodies and are influenced by what we do with our bodies. First off, quick question. How many bones are there in the average adult human body? Usually when I say this in a live class, I hear all sorts of answers. I hear 500, 604, 212. The truth is, it is 206 bones in the human body. Now, this is average. There are extra bones here and there. There are things called sesamoid bones, which are tiny little bones that grow in various areas due to high use and pressures. And in some cases, bones can be fused. As we're growing, we actually have more bones than we do when we're fully grown because those bones fuse together and become one, whereas during growth, sometimes they can be as many as 3. So that's why we ask the question very specifically, how many bones are there in the average adult human body? The answer is 206. Many people know what the skeleton does, but do you really? The skeletal system actually does a few different things for our bodies. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Fundamentally, the first one is the one that most people know about. That is, it supports the body. That's the reason why when I'm lecturing in front of the class, I'm not oozing around on the floor. Instead, I'm able to walk and move because the skeleton causes structure in my body. We have an endoskeleton, whereas bugs and things like that often have an outward carapace called an exoskeleton. So our legs, arms, spine, they support the body. But more, my teeth, which, by the way, keep in mind, are not bones, are supported in the bones of the jaw. So it supports everything as well as does other things. But the first and most obvious is support. The second, again, pretty obvious, is protection. The brain, the vital organs, they're protected. I can bonk my head into the wall and I won't die of a brain aneurysm because my brain is protected within my skull. The rib cage, also known as the thoracic cage, protects my heart and lungs so that if I get hit hard in the chest, I don't die of a heart attack. These are very important, but it also protects all sorts of other things in different ways. The spinal cord is protected within the vertebral column. So that's very important to know too. The third function that is also very obvious is movement. Skeletal muscles use the bones to move the body around. It works like levers, arms, legs, shoulders, jaw, your back, your spine. All of these things are able to move because of the skeleton and the way that when the muscles contract, they can pull different parts. Contracting, for example, your biceps muscle draws your arm kind of into a flexed position. Conversely, contracting with the triceps muscle straightens your arm out. The next function is a little less obvious. Function number 4 is bones are a reservoir for minerals. About 99% of the body's calcium is stored in bone. Mind you, bone is not just a pile of calcium. People know, or at least most people know, that that calcium is important for healthy bones, as is phosphorus and some other minerals that are often stored in the bone. But the idea that it is a reservoir for minerals is surprising to a lot of people. Think about what the word reservoir actually means. Does it mean it is a storage place that the calcium goes into and is never pulled out again? No. A reservoir means just that, is a temporary holding area from which we expect to draw that back out. For example, water in a reservoir of a given village or something like that is expected to be drawn back out and used for drinking and other things. So calcium in our bones is actually used for a lot of other things. One of the things calcium is used for is a contracting agent for muscle. So every time your muscles contract, that's the only thing muscles do, by the way, is they contract and relax. Every time your muscles contract, it's because a little bit of calcium is used to cause that contraction to happen. You do have calcium running through your blood, but we store excess calcium in our bones for various things. And one of those things is muscle contraction. And two of the very most important muscles in our bodies, probably doesn't come as any surprise, is the heart and the diaphragm muscle. The diaphragm muscle allows you to breathe. The heart, of course, allows the blood to be pumped through your body. Well, if the heart stops contracting, you die. So for that reason, if you're not getting enough calcium, then it's very important for the heart to be able to keep beating. And what happens? The certain cells in the body will draw that calcium back out of the bone and send it into the blood system to be used by important muscles like the heart and the diaphragm, allowing you to breathe and move blood throughout your body. The last one is probably the least well known of the function that the skeleton does for us. It is called hematopoiesis. What the hell does that mean? Hematopoiesis. What is that? Well, hema always means blood, like a hematoma, which is a big word for a swelling, or more common, a bruise. Hemato. Hematopoiesis. Poiesis means creation. So hematopoiesis, it's literally where blood cells are formed. The blood cells are formed inside the soft tissue that resides inside bone. It is called bone marrow. The bone marrow actually functions in two ways. One, it's a storage for fat, which, believe it or not, is actually very useful and important for our bodies. But the other thing that bone marrow does is creates blood cells. Your blood, basically, you have about 5 pints of blood in your body, average adult human, 5 to 6, depending. And you basically have a full oil change every, I don't know, month or so, usually about a little less. If you're a healthy person, relatively young, then you're usually having a full oil change. By oil, I mean blood, in your body just about every 2.5 weeks, which means if you give blood or lose blood for one reason or another, your body will replenish that blood fairly quickly. Old blood is then broken down and used. The components are used in the body or expelled through the spleen. Next, we have bone classification. Bone classification shouldn't be confused with bone function, which we just went over. Bone classification falls into 4 fundamental types of bone, and again, the first 2 are fairly straightforward. The second 2 are a little less obvious. What we're talking about with bone classification is the shape of bone, the overall big shape of bone. We put them into 4 fundamental categories. These categories are long bones, which, hold on to your seats here. Long bone is classified as bones that are much longer than they are wide. Dun, dun, dun. Although sometimes long bones are confusing. For example, the bones of the fingers and toes are considered long bone. It actually has a lot to do with their form overall, in how they're formed. The shaft with the epiphyses, meaning the midshaft, which is the center of the bone, looks kind of like a straw, which has that marrow running down the middle, which is called the medullary canal, where it resides. And on the ends, the epiphyses of the bone, which are the kind of articulate ends of the bone, where the articulation happens. Next, we have short bones. Most of the short bones are what are considered short bones are found in the wrist and ankle. These small bones are usually sort of cube-shaped. They actually come in all sorts of different shapes, and most of their names, like triquetral, that has to do with how many different surfaces it has. The trapezoid, of course, has to do with its shape, trapezium, capitate, hamate. All of these have to do with their shape. Lunate, which is pretty obvious, it's shaped kind of like a crescent moon. These are all your carpal bones. There are 8 total carpal bones. These are bones in the wrist. The analogous bones in the ankle, of which there are 7, really kind of are different shaped, but all of these shapes are kind of small and roughly as long as they are wide. Thus, they're called short bones. The next category of bones that we have in our bone classification are flat bones. The most obvious flat bone is the bone of the sternum. It is a very, very flat bone. There are some other bones that look like they should be considered different types of bone, but are considered flat bones. For example, the bones in the skull, particularly the cranial vault, that is, the bones that make up the part that protects your brain, are considered flat bones, even though they're kind of curved. And probably the most interesting for most people are that ribs are not considered long bones. They are considered flat bones. And this goes back to how they're formed. As I mentioned with the long bones, the ribs do not have a medullary cavity going down the middle, nor do they have epiphyses per se. They have ends, one of which goes toward the sternum. That is usually associated with the cartilage with which it joins up with. If you look at the highlighter here, you can see where the rib ends and the cartilage begins. That is because the ribs have to be able to move, kind of like a bucket handle, to enable breathing. Finally, we've got what I consider the cop-out category. That is sort of the waste bin, where we throw all of the bones that don't fit in with our other 3 categories. These are irregular bones. These are bones that are kind of a weird shape. The poster child for irregular bones is the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid is found in the skull, and if you look at it, people think it looks kind of like a bat or a butterfly with these kind of wings. In fact, in here is where the eyes sit in the skull. This is where the nose would be. The sphenoid is a single bone which goes through from one end of the skull all the way to the other. It almost acts like a linchpin of the skull. Other bones that are considered irregular bones are things like the bones of the vertebra and the scapula on the back of the shoulder blade. The os coxae are considered irregular bones usually, although some people will put them into a flat bone category, depending on who you ask. Next, we're going to talk about bone structure. Bones are organs, which means they're composed of a lot of different things. Remember, I mentioned bones are not just piles of calcium. They have a lot of calcium in them, but they're actually made of multiple tissue types as well. Calcium and phosphorus are not tissue types. Those are minerals that are stored in the bone and help build the bone. But the bone tissues come in many different parts, which means bones are organs. Bones are not a single tissue type. They have bone tissue, that's fairly obvious, which is also known as hydroxyapatite. Fibrous connective tissue, which is your cartilage and ligaments and that sort of stuff. Fibrous connective tissue is very, very tough stuff. It's actually tougher than leather. It's the semi kind of bendable material that connects things. Next is cartilage. Cartilage comes in various forms. Cartilage is also used to pre-build bone. It's almost like the the structure or the scaffolding for which bone builds up around. Cartilage does ossify. It becomes bone sometimes. Different areas of the body will ossify that were cartilage for a long time. Other parts don't. Certain cartilage will stay cartilage and stay malleable, like the tip of your nose and your ears. Your outer ear is that typical cartilage that is the fiber cartilage that really stays the way it is. Vascular tissue. What is vascular tissue? Vascular tissue is veins and arteries. And bones, being organs, those tissues need oxygen, need nutrients, and blood pushes that through. There are other ways of getting nutrients in and out of bone, which we will probably not get into, but the vascular tissue, in fact, the blood in the body is kind of referred to as the superhighway of the body. You can imagine blood being like semi-trucks that drive around and move things from one place to another. They move oxygenated blood out to help keep all of the cells in the body alive. They also move nutrients around, all sorts of things that the blood does, but it does it fast. There are slower versions of this as well, which is our next step, the lymphatic tissue. You may have heard if you're not feeling well or something and you go up to your mom, oh, mom, I've got a sore throat. She reaches sort of down at the base of your jaw onto your neck and says, oh, your lymph nodes are swollen. Have you heard that? You guys remember hearing that? Lymph is a secondary vascular system through your body. Lymph moves very, very slowly. You can think of this as almost like the dirt roads of our body compared to the highway that is blood. Lymph kind of oozes around. It is lymph that causes the swelling when you sprain your ankle and it swells up. What your body's trying to do is immobilize that joint to protect it. Sort of like putting on an ace bandage on the outside, but it's doing it on the inside. The problem with that, of course, is it reduces the amount of blood that can then flow through there, and blood brings in healing components and takes out components that are not needed in that area anymore. So actually reducing the swelling helps aid in healing, although if you have to still run for your life or you're out hunting and gathering or whatever, you're going to need that swelling to help protect your ankle until it does heal. Lastly, we have nervous tissue. What is nervous tissue? It's not tissue that's having a bad day. It is tissue that is nerves. They are your electrical impulse system throughout the body. It tells things to happen, and it also reports what is happening back to the brain. So when you want to twitch your muscles, it's nervous tissue. When you have a bone break and it hurts, that's your nerves too. We'll talk about other aspects of the anatomy of bone coming up. This is another type of tissue formation of bone. There is a term called spongy bone and another term called compact bone. I don't use these very often. I usually use trabecular bone. It means the same thing as spongy bone, but it's not as misleading as the term spongy bone. Generally, you will hear me refer to it as trabecular bone for this reason. I'll explain what that means in just a minute. The other one is cortical bone. Compact bone is sort of also a misnomer. It's not really, but it can be confusing to students who are new to this. So I tend to call that cortical bone. Cortical bone is that nice smooth outer surface bone that we're used to seeing. Trabecular bone is the cancellous bone on the inside of particularly we find it in the bone ends and we find it in flat bone throughout. It is, when you look at the edge of a broken bone, you'll see these sort of pits and holes in there, these little pinpoints. These are made up of cavities that are within the trabecular bone, not the same type of cavities as you get in your tooth. But in these areas here, you see these little pinpoints. And that's great. The reason it gets its term spongy bone is because it looks like a cross-section of a household sponge. The problem with that is people get this misinterpretation that it's somehow softer or made out of something different than the cortical, also known as compact bone, that is on the outside. The truth is, it's made of the exact same stuff. The only difference is their form, how they're formed. The trabecular bone, which usually is concentrated in the ends of long bones, you can actually think of it as girders within the bone, sort of like girders within a building. You can see that these girders are built up to react to pressure put on from all these different directions. What I'm pointing out right here is the head of the femur. This bone, the femur, is your upper thigh bone. And at the head, it forms a joint with your hip. It's a ball and socket. You can tell that this part is the ball, and it goes into the socket of what's called the acetabulum in the os coxa, which is your hip bone. So in here, it's getting the stress of all the weight of your body when you run and jump. That's where it takes it, and it goes all the way through the neck of the femur into the shaft of the femur. So this whole area is very built up. Why isn't it made of solid bone? Well, because just like us, Mother Nature wants to take shortcuts and use the least amount to get the most amount. So what she does is she has these holes in there, but there's more to it than just that. This is the medullary canal, for which I referred to earlier. In here, in life, it's filled with bone marrow, which is creating blood cells and storing fat, both of which are very important for our body. Well, actually, inside each one of these little pinpricks, these little empty holes, in life, they're not empty. They are also filled up with bone marrow. So it's important for the body to be able to create that blood. And sometimes we'll actually see spongy bone expand into the cortical bone areas, like down through here and up in here, in order to create more red blood cells in the body in cases of anemia and things like that. So spongy bone is also extremely hard. It is not soft, so that's why I tend to call it trabecular bone. It's a little bit more that way you associate it with bone and not a sponge. It is very, very hard, just as hard as the cortical bone on the outside. The difference is the shape. And it is simply shaped that way to have the most strength using the least amount of material. There's another soft tissue that both surrounds and is on the inside of bone. Around the outside, this soft tissue is called the periosteum. It's a skin-like tissue, but it houses several things. It houses some cells within the bone that help the bone grow, as well as help break bone matter down. And those two cells we'll talk about a little bit later are extremely important for virtually everything bone does. There is a similar tissue on the inside called an endosteum, but let's talk about the periosteum first. Peri means around, like perimeter. So the periosteum, osteo always means what? Bone. So periosteum means it's around the bone. This soft tissue contains a lot of blood vessels, it contains a lot of nerve tissue, and it also contains a certain cell that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The internal bone surface is covered with the same substance, but it's on the inside, so we call it endosteum. I actually hate this picture. So if you think back to that other picture, the endosteum would be on the inside of that medullary canal, as well as on the inside of every one of those little pinpricks in the trabecular bone. The endosteum also houses a certain cell that helps with bone growth and bone reaction. And we'll talk about those next. Okay, associated with the periosteum are these bone cells. They're bone building cells called osteoblasts. It may sound like it's kind of a confusing term because osteoblast sounds like they're blowing up, they're exploding. But think of it like this. Osteoblasts are bone building cells. So blasts build. In fact, that's the way, if you ever take organic chemistry, or even more so, if you get into cellular biology, you'll learn about blasts. Blastic activity means building activity. So osteo, they're building. What are they building? Bone. Osteoblasts. They're mostly housed in the periosteum. We'll find out why later on. But the osteoblasts are your bone building cells. Without them, bone would not be able to build, heal, or sort of change shape according to what pressures we put upon them. So the osteoblasts are extremely important. These little, you can see indicated by the yellow arrows and the blue arrows here, the osteoblasts. I guess they're indicated by the blue arrows. The yellow is supposed to be the bone matrix, which they're building in front of them. You can see that kind of pinkish surface. Osteoblasts, bone. Think of Bob the Builder. I don't know if that's too old of a reference anymore, but blasts build. Just put those things together. Think about osteoblasts with their little hard hats on, going to work, building stuff up. We met the osteoblasts. Now we're meeting the osteoclasts. That's this big googly-eyed monster. It looks like a Zoidberg. Osteoblasts are much smaller, and they are building that bony matrix. Osteoclasts, these large, multicellular things, actually break bone down. They're essentially recycling centers for bone. They take the bone, they break it into its fundamental components, and then put those components out into the highway system. What was that again? The blood. So the osteoclasts are breaking down either old or broken or cellular tissue that they need for one reason or another from the bone. Osteoclast. A C is a clastic activity is breaking down. B, build. C, I don't know a good euphemism for breaking something down. I guess recycling. That's a stretch. All right, so osteoclasts are bone recyclers. They don't destroy bone. Don't get that idea. What they do is break it back down into its constituent components. So for example, if grandma is sitting on the couch watching QVC, does she need a lot of calcium in her bones? No. Her bones aren't getting stressed very much. She's not using her bones much. Is she using her heart still? You bet she is. So if she's using that heart, what component that's stored in the bone needs to be used in the blood to keep that heart beating and keep that diaphragm squeezing to enable her to breathe? Calcium. So the osteoclasts are the cell that pulls the calcium out of the bone, puts it back into the bloodstream for the body to be able to use elsewhere. We'll see other things that osteoblasts and osteoclasts do later on, other than just building and recycling cellular components that we find in the bone. Okay, the most obvious way that I think a lot of us can associate with as far as the osteoclastic and osteoblastic activity is how braces work. Braces on your teeth. How do they work? Well, you know that you go to the orthodontist and they apply a bracket to each tooth. And through those brackets, they run a wire. And every week or so, they tighten that wire up. What are they doing? They're putting a constant pressure on that tooth. They're pulling the tooth in one direction, trying to get it back to where it should be in your mouth. If your teeth are out of place, this is how we move them. The orthodontist doesn't go in with a pair of pliers, rip out the tooth, and shove it back into your mouth where it belongs, right? Instead, they're using the osteoblastic and osteoclastic activities to move our tooth to where we want it. Now, first of all, it's not in the tooth itself, is it? No. The tooth is not a bone, remember. A tooth is a tooth. Bone heals, teeth don't. So what we're doing is we're migrating the tooth through the bone. Remember, it's embedded in the bone of the jaw. So the constant pressure in the tooth. Now we're going to put everything that we just learned together. The constant pressure of the tooth is pushing now up against, you guys can see it's moved the tooth. So from this picture here, we're forcing this tooth this direction. And you can see as the tooth is being pushed, what's happening here is we're feeling pressure. Where's that pressure? It's in the periosteum that lines this whole thing. So the periosteum feels the pressure and it says, hey, there's pressure here. We don't want pressure anywhere in the bone. So who goes to work to remove the bone to alleviate that pressure? Osteoclasts. So you can see the osteoclasts in the front and the leading edge here are going to work removing all this extra bone. Meanwhile, on the back side, there is now a tension. It's being pulled away. So the periosteum again says, hey, I can't feel the pressure here, which means we need bone here. So who goes to work? The osteoblasts start working on this side, building up this side of the bone. And what's going to happen over time, the bone's going to build here, it's going to be resorbed here, the tooth itself is going to migrate to where we want it. Does that make sense? Bone matrix. This is another thing that people get confused by. Bone matrix is what makes up the bone tissue itself. Remember, bones, the whole bone is an organ. But in that organ, there is bone tissue, which I mentioned before is called hydroxyapatite. Well, hydroxyapatite consists of two fundamental components. Organic components. Organic components are things that can rot, right? They're things that can break down, like without a physical way. For example, collagen, cartilage. Those are two of the most common protein components of bone matrix. These are the organic components in bone. The organic components in bone, just like the cartilage that builds up, that makes up the outside of your nose and the outside of your ears, it's bendy, isn't it? Cartilage is bendy. So is collagen. So cartilage allows the bone to actually be stronger because that organic component in the bone allows the bone to bend a little bit without breaking. Conversely, the inorganic component, these are the mineral components in the bone. We've already talked about those as well. The mineral components are things like calcium and phosphorus. Calcium salts, which is what that is, it's a mineral, and that is very rigid. It's very tough. It doesn't bend much. But if you had too much of that and not enough of the organic component, bones would be very brittle. However, if you have too much of the organic component and not enough of the inorganic or mineral component, bones would be way too soft, too wobbly. We met that earlier on. Remember when we were talking about the mostly childhood malady of rickets? Rickets is caused by a lack of vitamin D, which is caused by a lack of sunlight, which does not allow the bones to absorb calcium, which thereby renders the bones with too little calcium, meaning they don't have enough of the inorganic component, and they're too bendy. They're too malleable. So when the child's weight is put on those bones for a long period of time, the bones bend. Quickie question. This bone, which is the tibia, in case you can't quite recognize it, has it been demineralized, meaning have we removed the inorganic component, the minerals, or have we removed the organic component? Well, you can see that that bone is tied into a pretzel. It's not supposed to be able to be tied into a pretzel. So what happened? We removed the mineral component. It has been demineralized, meaning it's way, way bendy now. You can see it's almost rubber-like. The trabecular bone that is found, layer that is found in between the two cortical bone layers in the skull. This is really only in the vault of the skull. Even though it's the same trabecular bone you find everywhere else in the body, only in the skull it is referred to as diploid or diplo. I don't know how you pronounce the umlaut thing in German very well. So the diplo is only pronounced or only considered in the skull, even though it's the same trabecular bone that you find everywhere else. The reason for this is based on a clinical differential diagnosis of certain diseases, specifically things like anemia will cause a profusion of the diplo through the cortical bone to where you can see it. And this could also be found in x-rays and things like that, which is indicative of long-term anemia. But that doesn't matter. The point that you have to remember, it would be a great test question, for example, is that in the skull is where you find diplo. So if you see that word diplo, you always know that we're talking about the skull. Osteogenesis. What is osteogenesis? Well, osteo means bone. Genesis means the process of growth or creation. In other words, what we're talking about is process of bone tissue formation. So that's where we're going to go next. We're going to talk about how bone grows, changes, and reacts. What we're talking about is how you can tell the difference between an adult and a juvenile or non-adult bone. And it also illustrates how these bones grow. First of all, what we're looking at here, this is a knee joint. You're looking at a human knee. Up here is the thigh bone. This is the femur, the upper thigh bone. The patella, you can barely see. It's kind of grayed out here. Down here is the tibia. That is the big, heavy lower leg bone below your knee. And this is the fibula, which is kind of buried in your calf muscle, really. It's a tiny little bone compared to the tibia. But in all three of these, do you guys see this little space here? This kind of void going through. What is that? Well, that's what's typically referred to as your growth plate. We call it the epiphyseal plate. Epiphyseal meaning it's sort of in the ends of the bone. The epiphyseal plates are growth plates. That is, in life, as I mentioned before, remember cartilage acts like almost a precursor of bone. It is like the scaffolding which becomes ossified later on. So here, cartilage is what's holding these together. Cartilage, as you'll know from what we just talked about before, is a protein component. That means it is an organic component. So the cartilage, if this individual was to die, the cartilage would rot away. However, the bone, which is 2/3 inorganic, meaning 2/3 mineral component, will stay around for a much, much longer period of time. Ostensibly forever, until it somehow mechanically gets broken. So what we're looking at here is a juvenile knee because these growth plates are still here. They haven't fused together yet. An adult, these will fully ossify and fuse this end to the rest of the shaft. And the same with all the other bones here. So when we see that they have not fused yet, we can tell it is a juvenile or non-adult knee that we're looking at. Okay, how else do we see growth in bone? Here we're looking at the mid-shaft of the femur. If you look here, it's been transversely cut through the shaft of the femur, and now we're looking at this little section here. And as I mentioned before, it looks kind of like a straw. There's this hole down the middle, which we now know in life is filled with the bone marrow. This is called the medullary canal. Around this edge is the endosteum, and out here is the periosteum. Here are most of the osteoclasts, and out here are most of the osteoblasts, the bone building cells. In here are the bone resorbing cells. We're going to talk about why that is for just a minute. Well, several things are going on with the shaft of the bone. First of all, you can notice that for the most part, the femur, the middle of that femur anyway, the shaft is relatively round. It's a cylinder. Cylinders are extremely tough. I don't know if you've ever tried to crush a cylinder end to end. It's tough. In fact, you can stand on a beer can, and if it's still in its cylindrical shape, it'll pretty much hold up your body weight within reason. But what we're seeing is growth from infant to child to adult. And the weirdest thing is, we would expect this wall to get thicker, wouldn't we? And it does. Between the infant and the adult, you can see that the adult bone is much thicker. But furthermore, look, this infant bone, the whole bone, inside and outside, could slide inside the medullary cavity of the adult bone, which means that not only is the bone growing in thickness on the outside, but actually this hole in the middle is getting widened as well. You can see from infant to child, the child medullary canal is much larger than that in the infant, and in the adult, it's larger still. Why? The big question is, why have a giant hole down the middle of the bone? Wouldn't the bone be stronger if it was nearly solid? Truth is this. First of all, the medullary canal, has to get larger when the individual gets larger because we're growing. We need more blood in our bodies and actually more fat storage, which is interesting, but true. Furthermore, the bone doesn't need to be that thick to be very, very strong. Let me give you an example. Your bicycle. Your bike frame is not made out of solid steel, is it? In fact, it's probably not made out of steel anymore at all. It's probably either aluminum or something like that. But why is it hollow? Because obviously it would be too heavy. Can you imagine riding up a hill on a solid steel bike made out of bars instead of tubes? It'd be crazy. It'd be very heavy. But furthermore, does the bike need to be solid to be strong? No. Because of the form of a cylinder, they're extremely strong. It's really hard to bend a cylinder. If you take, for example, a pound of steel and make that pound of steel into, I don't know, a rod that's 1/4 of an inch wide and a foot long, can you bend that? Absolutely. Absolutely you could. But now take that same pound of steel and make that into a tube. Make the tube, I don't know, 2 inches in diameter. Hollow in the middle, very thin wall. Can you bend that? You can't. Same pound, same weight, and yet when it's in the cylinder form, it is much tougher as far as bending or compressing. It's extremely tough. Well, these theories are based on nature, and it's engineering, fundamental engineering, and Mother Nature came up with it. So the shaft of the adult human femur is extremely tough. So much so, get this, an average adult human femur, just one of them, do you know how much weight it can actually support before it fails? It can hold up over a ton of weight, 2,000 pounds. More than that, it will finally collapse. And I know what you're thinking. Geez, that sounds like it's overbuilt, doesn't it? It is. And yet we can still break a bone, can't we? Skiing and doing all kinds of stuff. We're going to talk about bone fractures in a little bit. Very fun talk.